Hello, and welcome to this module, Advanced Topic in Christian Ethics, or Jesus and Mission in the Shadow of Empire. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Graham Adams, the lead tutor for this module, but will also be joined by some of my colleagues for particular sessions. And there will be one or two sessions where you'll be released from the screen to explore some ideas for yourselves. We'll explain more about the plan when we meet. So why consider issues of empire? It's a topic which feels as though it has increasingly been in the news in recent months and years. It has been discussed in relation to the Brexit debate. It certainly has been part of the conversation in the light of Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the toppling of particular statues in public spaces. There have been arguments for some time that the UK needs to reckon with its imperial past, because it is not something which just exists in the past. It shapes how people think of themselves in the present, and not just at a personal level, but in relationships and structures. And Paul Gilroy, for instance, has spoken of post-imperial melancholia because of a collective sense that an empire was lost and that Britain is still struggling to find a new identity for itself. And there are arguments increasingly too, in the context of education and more widely, that we need to engage in decolonial thinking and practice, which in a sense is to go one step further, not merely identifying how we have been affected by historical realities of colonialism, whether as the colonised or the coloniser, but challenging ourselves to critique, to unpick, to dismantle those psychological and political frameworks. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm just touching on the idea that empire is a huge issue with tentacles in many directions, and we won't address them all in this single course, but we will allude to many. We will raise questions which you may want to follow up. We will identify intersections between all sorts of issues, and we will be arguing that it is indeed such a huge issue that it is all pervasive. It is a framework within which we live our lives. So you may find yourself seeing it more than you had expected, in ways we won't even touch on in our discussions. And we look forward to hearing your experiences, your insights and analysis, and your imaginative leaps. We certainly hope that there will be something collaborative going on, even as we work with this online medium. But we need to give a bit of focus time to the question, but what is empire? At one level, we feel that we recognise it when we stumble across it, but even through this module, we'll be playing with and bringing together two distinct approaches to it. First, there are the historical empires generated by particular nation-states, or centred in particular civilizations, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, or later the British Empire, the French Empire, and so on. We will focus quite a lot on the Roman Empire, the one that shaped the psychological and social environment in which Jesus of Nazareth engaged in ministry, and within it we will identify particular strands of imperial behaviour. But then we will have a conversation backwards and forwards between that particular historical empire and our current context, which in the UK is still affected by Britain's historical empire. But in this contemporary mode, we will seek to bring to the surface an analysis of the second approach to the meaning of empire, which is less to do with a particular nation-state and its colonialism, and more to do with a theological judgment about the system within which we live and breathe and have our being. The second kind of empire is much larger and is characterized as the system which impedes, obstructs, resists the very unfolding of God's alternative reality, the kingdom of God. We will come to this tension between empire and kingdom, not least because the Greek word basileia, translated as kingdom, is also the word translated as empire. So to speak of God's kingdom as an alternative empire is to name something important. God's empire is not like the other empires. So where does this theological judgment come from? There are particular ecumenical movements, that is, bodies of churches working together with each other, which have identified this as a critical way of capturing the nature of reality. And it's significant, I think, that this arises in particular from the ecumenical movement, since the roots of the word ecumenical, or oikumene, are concerned with the oikos, the house, which is also at the root of economy and ecology. So the house or household in question is not only the very immediate household where we live and eat, but the whole household of life, how we live with one another within a vast and complex network of life in ecumenical solidarity, economic dynamics, and ecological webs of relationships. The household of Christian churches, recognizing that we live within a broader household of life, identifies an empire which serves the interests of some within this household, but not the interests of all, and certainly damages our solidarity with one another within this household. So in 2004, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, which then was called the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, issued a statement, a confession, which named empire in these terms: as seekers of truth and justice, and looking through the eyes of powerless and suffering people, we see that the current world disorder is rooted in an extremely complex and immoral economic system defended by empire. In using the term empire, we mean the coming together of economic, cultural, political, and military power that constitutes a system of domination led by powerful nations to protect and defend their own interests. So empire is constituted, we see there, by a coming together of different powers or forces, constituting a system of domination. We can think too of Walter Wink's series of works back in the 1990s, culminating in Engaging the Powers, which identified a domination system, and we will refer more to this. Then in 2010, the Council for World Mission, a successor organisation to what was the London Missionary Society, a particular missionary society which spread the gospel largely within the British Empire, but in the second half of the 20th century it began to reckon with that history and turned its model of mission into one shaped by mutual partnership, where each part of the global church shares with other parts. And so in 2010, the organisation's new theology statement was called Mission in the Context of Empire, and it worked with a longer definition. This definition is a guide for much of what we do in this course. That doesn't mean we're not able to engage critically with it, because we certainly are, but it raises issues which we will explore. A reality created by humankind and yet simultaneously enslaving, an all-encompassing global reality which serves the interests of an elite, which excludes and even sacrifices many people from its benefits and exploits creation. A destructive spirit, proclaimed through propaganda and religiously justified and followed, marked by the colonization of consciousness, and I would add, and the colonization of unconsciousness, affecting values and notions of human life, lacking in compassionate justice, showing disregard for the gifts of creation and the household of life. I would particularly want to emphasize 4 dimensions to this. The psychological, that is, it colonizes our mindset, how we see reality. The anthropological, it is made by us, but enslaving of many people. The political, it is built into the structures of our world with a particular power dynamic. And the religious, it consists of propaganda, justifications, obedience, all with a religious flavour. In each case, theology is at work and theology has something to say. We won't consciously identify the particular strand that we're addressing at any one time, partly because it functions at all of those levels all of the time. But it is worth noting with emphasis that it isn't just an external thing outside of us or something non-religious. It gets us and conditions us at many levels. As Rieger puts it, empire affects everything, not just politics or economics, but also culture, intellectual life, emotional sensitivities, personal relationships, and even our images of the sacred. Empires seek to shape us all the way to the core, including our deepest beliefs and values. But, he says, no empire has ever managed to control us completely. And so there is always the possibility that some of our beliefs and values provide support in resistance against empire. There we see the first glimpse of the potential for resistance. It colonizes every part of us, but there's always something, perhaps just a possibility, a seed, or some yeast mixed in with the dough, or perhaps just a child, a little child, something small, almost imperceptible, something where there is the potential for resistance, an alternative horizon. So when we meet together, we will do 3 things in our first session. We will look at the nuts and bolts of the module, the overview of what we will cover, and the assignment for those doing the course for credit. And we will discuss these notions of empire further with one another to see what you make of them, acknowledging that in order to make connections between Rome and this larger current reality, there's some degree of imaginative leaping going on. And we will begin to envisage what responding to empire, missionally and ethically, might mean for us. What questions might we ask? So I look forward to being with you and taking these things further.